In Unit 4, we will talk about how our nation does in its first few years after the signing and ratification of the Constitution. Unit 4 will then focus on how America begins to expand from just 13 states to eventually owning all the land we do today. After the Constitution was signed at the convention in Philadelphia in 1787, the Constitution was sent out to all of the 13 states. Each state had to vote to accept or ratify the Constitution. Once they accepted the Constitution, they were officially admitted as a state to the Union. The Union is another name for the United States. The process of ratification took almost 2 years for all of the 13 states to agree to pass the Constitution. Once the Constitution was ratified in all 13 states in 1789, it was time to choose a new leader for our country. The new leader for America would be known as the President. The President was to be elected under a new voting system called the Electoral College. You will remember that the Electoral College is a complicated system in which the citizens, or the everyday ordinary people, tell the electors whom they want to be president by casting their vote. It is then the job of the electors to cast their own votes for whom they think should be president. In the first election using this new system, every single vote that was cast by an elector was cast for George Washington. He is the only president in the history of our country to receive every single vote, and he does this not only once, but twice. He was elected because he was beloved by the people, and everyone believed in his leadership skills. Elections, even with the Electoral College, are not the same today as they were back then. Today, when somebody runs for president, they choose a running mate to run with them as their vice president, like how Obama chose Biden or how George W. Bush chose Cheney. Back then, that was not the case. Back then, people just ran for president. First place would become president, and second place, or the runner-up, was supposed to become vice president. Well, when Washington won all of the votes in the Electoral College, there was no runner-up. They had to hold an entirely second election to pick the vice president. The vice president they chose under Washington was to be John Adams. You will remember that John Adams was an important patriot in the Revolutionary War time frame, and that he helped to write the Declaration of Independence. This electoral college system where the runner-up becomes vice president will quickly change by the time of the third presidential election. You can imagine how messy it would be to have a president from one political party and a vice president from another. That is why we do things the way we do today, where the main candidate running picks a running mate for vice president. George Washington represents everything that Americans hope their presidents would be like. One of the things Washington personally credits with making him who he was is owning his farm in Virginia. It was on this farm in Virginia that he learned the value of hard work, what it meant to own land in America, and it also served as his retreat from his presidency. His farm in Virginia is called Mount Vernon. Mount Vernon featured a gorgeous 22-room mansion, and it also contained 8,000 acres of farmland, and at one time employed almost 300 slaves. Washington was very proud to be an American, but he was also proud to be a Virginian. In fact, Virginia would go on to be the state that produced more presidents than any other state. Washington not only owned 8,000 acres here at Mount Vernon, but also tens of thousands of acres in 6 other states. His vast land ownings made him extremely wealthy and also made him encourage the expansion of the United States to the west. George Washington was the first president of the United States. In fact, he was the first president that the world had ever seen. He had no models to go off of when deciding what to do in office. He literally walked on untrodden ground, which means he walked where no one had walked before. Since Washington had no one to show him how to be president, he got the power to create and shape the office of the presidency into what we see and know today. He had to be careful when he was deciding what to do as president because he did not want too much power like the kings and queens of Europe, but he had to make sure that he had enough power that the presidency was still somewhat powerful. Washington also knew that whatever decisions he made, they would be copied by all future presidents. He was under a lot of pressure to get the job done right. Some of the things that Washington helped create include the United States currency, the United States dollar bill, the Supreme Court, and the United States Navy. Because Washington was the first president, he established many precedents. You should remember that a precedent is something that is set by someone that all people after that will follow. Basically, this means that Washington established 6 practices of the presidency that all presidents still do to this day. These precedents include creating a cabinet, proposing legislation to Congress, giving a State of the Union address, setting the social schedule of the president, allowing the president to take vacations to their home, and retiring after 2 terms. Washington created a cabinet because he knew his strengths and weaknesses. He knew that to be a good president, he would need some help. You remember that Washington's first cabinet only had 4 members, and that Washington paid for these men to help him out of his own pocket. The presidential cabinet still exists today, but has grown into a number of positions that help the president run the country. Washington also decided that one of the jobs of the president should be to write laws and propose them to Congress. He thought that since he was the leader of the country, it was in his power to shape the country into a vision that he had. He helped protect checks and balances, though, by making sure Congress would approve the laws he proposed. This still happens today. For example, Obama proposed to Congress that we should send more military troops to fight ISIS, but it is up to Congress to decide whether they want to do that or not. Washington also created the State of the Union address. Every single year, the president gives a speech to the entire nation on how the president feels the country is doing. In this speech, the president also outlines their goals for the upcoming year. However, the very most important precedent that Washington establishes was retiring after 2 terms. The entire country would have had Washington serve for many more years because he was such an awesome president. But Washington knew that if he stayed in office longer, all the presidents after him would also stay in office longer. He was scared that in the future someone would become president and never retire, and they would gain too much power. Washington retiring after 2 terms ensured that this would not happen. In fact, because all of the presidents followed Washington's lead, it did not become law that a president could only serve 2 terms until 1947. Washington had a great presidency, but there were also many problems that Washington had to deal with during his presidency because our country was so new. The problems that Washington faced all had to do with the debt our country was left in after the Revolutionary War. If you remember, under the Articles of Confederation, our national government had no money or power to raise taxes. It was decided that each state would pay their own portion of Revolutionary War debt off. Now, however, we have a constitution, and our government now has the power to tax. So they're going to want to settle the Revolutionary War debt a little bit differently. One of the men that Washington picked to serve on his cabinet was Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton is now known as the guy on the $10 bill. But Hamilton was picked to be the Secretary of Treasury by Washington. This made him the man in charge of all of our country's money. Hamilton felt very strongly that the best way to start off our country on a good financial start was for our country to be the one that paid off the Revolutionary War debt, not the individual states. He wanted all the remaining debt to be paid off by the national government. This sounds all well and great, but this is more than 10 years after the Revolutionary War, and some states, especially the wealthy ones, had already paid off their portion of the war debt. They did not feel like it was fair that they had to pay their debt, and now the other states are going to have their debt paid by the national government. The state that disagreed with Hamilton's plan the most was Virginia. They refused to accept Hamilton's plan, and it looked like the nation was going to be in need of another compromise. Virginia and Alexander Hamilton were able to reach an agreement. Virginia wanted the capital of the country to be moved to their backyard. If Virginia received the capital, then they felt like they would be okay with all of the debt for the rest of the states to be paid off by the national government. After this agreement with Hamilton was made, Virginia gave up a little bit of land to put the capital in Washington, D.C. It was moved from New York City to where it currently is today. Virginia was so eager to have the capital closer to them because the closer you are to power, the more you get of it. Also, the capital would bring a lot of money to the state of Virginia. Now that Hamilton's plan of paying off the Revolutionary War debt for all the states had been approved, he must find a way to actually pay off the debt. The only way for a government to pay off debt, though, is to raise taxes. And you know how us Americans feel about taxes. Hamilton started taxing imports, but this created tension between northern states and southern states because southern states had to import everything because they were too busy to farm. Hamilton decided to remove the tax on imports to calm things down a bit. He then decided he should try taxing exports. But this also created tension between the North and the South because the South had to export all of their crops. They didn't feel like it was fair that they were being taxed higher again. To ease the tension, Hamilton gets rid of this tax also. Hamilton finally decides that he will raise the money to pay off the Revolutionary War debt by taxing whiskey. Whiskey is made from corn. This tax is really going to hurt farmers. It's going to create a lot of tension between the agricultural western parts of our country and the settled urban eastern parts of our country. The tax on whiskey was very high for many farmers in western Pennsylvania. They decided to do what they had always done when they did not like a tax. They decided to rebel, to loot, to burn, and to even tar and feather tax collectors. A full-fledged rebellion known as the Whiskey Rebellion broke out in Pennsylvania. This situation felt very similar to Shays' Rebellion, and the whole country turned their attention to Washington to see how he was going to handle it. Washington was very upset about how the farmers in Pennsylvania handled their feelings about the tax on whiskey. As president, he decided once again to personally march an army to Pennsylvania. This time was different from Shays' Rebellion, though. He was able to tell the people who were rebelling that if they wanted to change the taxes, or if they wanted to change the laws, they had to go about it the right way. They had to follow the Constitution. Washington set a major precedent with the way he handled the Whiskey Rebellion. He showed that the government would use force to maintain order, and he also showed that the Constitution would be heavily enforced. Now that you are done learning about the years of Washington's presidency, please follow the instructions for what you need to do for the rest of the day and for homework for tonight. Thank you for watching.